Let's say do.
I have to hang
What
it.
it should do.
Yeah, like this.
Yeah. Hello. Okay, so let us start.
Pin it.
Firstly, good afternoon and also greetings on the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And today we are going to have a special joint ASSET colloquium as being organized jointly by ASSET and also TIFR Committee on Gender Harmony. And it's indeed great pleasure. Today we have Dr. Nair here, who is going to speak about portrait of women as Nomad scientist. But before I even proceed further, I request Baswati to formally introduce today's speaker and also conduct rest of the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. Well, a significant gender gap actually exists and persists throughout all, at all levels of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics disciplines. While women have made tremendous progress in the area of higher education, but they're still underrepresented in research in these domains. And in 2015, the UN General Assembly, through a resolution, earmarked the day 11th of February as the International Day for Women and Girls in Science. At TIFR, every year we try to commemorate the day with a talk which sort of emphasizes the role and contribution of women in science. And today we'll hear about the Indian botanist and geneticist E.K. Janaki Ammal from Dr. Savithri Preetha Nair, who has recently published a biography of Janaki Ammal titled Chromosome Woman, Nomad Scientist, E.K. Janaki Ammal, Alive. Before I hand over the microphone to Dr. Nair, I want to introduce her briefly. This is also a great opportunity. She received her doctorate in 2003 from the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, for her dissertation on the museum and the shaping of sciences in colonial India. Her research interests include the history of science, modernity, and enlightenment at the turn of the 19th century, the history and politics of collecting for science, the sociology of knowledge, the public museum, and women in science in colonial and post-colonial India. She has written several papers in peer-reviewed international journals and edited volumes. Two of her other books that she has written are Science and the Changing Environment in India, a guide to sources in the Indian Office Records 1780 to 1920, which she co-authored with Richard Axelby, and the monograph Raja Sarfoji II, Science, Medicine, and Enlightenment in Tanjore. So without further ado and without taking more of your time, I request Dr. Nair to take us away into the world of E.K. Janaki Ammal.
Thank you very much, Baswati. Thanks very much to the TIFR, to Drs. Sandhya Kaushika in particular, Dr. Baswati and Dr. Satyanarayana to make this possible, to, give me an opportunity to speak about Janaki Ammal at TIFR. I would think one of the most unlikeliest of places for Janaki, for the kind of science that Janaki did. Also very, very pleased that I have this opportunity to speak about Janaki to commemorate the International Day of Women and Girls in the STEM. Almost all published sources on the history of women in science have had as their primary focus Europe and North America, with Asia, Africa, Australia, and South America hardly figuring in them. Wiping clean this selective clouding of history, this biography, which I have here, which is just recently published, Routledge, New York, London, 2023. It marks the beginning of a grand, very ambitious recovery project, which I have embarked on, of Indian women in science. That E.K. Janaki Ammal was not alone on this journey is what her biography, her story reveals. The biography offers a glimpse of the heterogeneous and unanticipated landscape that existed even in the early decades of the 20th century, one that was inhabited by women in science, and men, of course, across nationalities, who tended to form a creative counterculture or sorority of an informal or a formal kind, spanning continents and co-producing scientific knowledge. Each of these women were path breakers and made a success of their careers in their chosen fields of science. But as it stood, we knew nothing about this terrain, which I've just started excavating. This was the first time I was exploring life writing, or the biographical method to shine light on the constructed nature of scientific knowledge, or simply on how science gets done, or even on the very Denkstill or thought styles, or if you like, the differing styles of doing science. Life writing, as you know, is a labor of love, demanding on the part of the biographer enormous mental resources and great stretches of solitary time to befriend and know intimately her biography, but also to be objective and cautious to avoid hagiography, the pitfall of most biographies. Further, in non-Western societies, especially for those individuals long gone, it's almost impossible to find a well-organized archive of private papers, or even a semblance of an archive that could be employed for the reconstruction of a life, posing a huge challenge to the biographer. On one occasion, for instance, in the present case, material was recovered serendipitously from a garbage heap, and on another, fortuitously rediscovered after years of lying buried, thanks to a typographical error in the catalogue of one of the world's finest university libraries. Corralling archival material, although locating was not an easy task, I could not complain of a scarcity of sources in the case of Janaki. So this has been done over several years, almost a decade in this case, and then sifting through this trembling mountain of abandoned workings to discover nuggets of gold has without doubt been painstaking, but also immensely rewarding, something on which I hope will be reflected on the pages of this volume, which, as far as I am aware, is the first in-depth and archive-based study of the life of an Asian woman scientist, and not just Indian. My book tells the story of the life and science of a trailblazing Indian woman cytogeneticist, plant cytogeneticist, a close contemporary of the Nobel-winning American maize geneticist Barbara McClintock. Janaki was the only one among those Indian women born prior to 1900 to make a successful career in science, and yet remains a largely unknown figure. She was the first Indian woman to earn a doctorate in the botanical sciences, specializing in cytology and genetics, which she did in 1931 from the University of Michigan. If the first reason that propelled this extensive biography is a recovery project of Indian women in science, the second reason is that Janaki's story offers a defamiliarization of the 20th century world. It reconstructs the world from the perspective of a pioneering and highly mobile Indian woman scientist, thereby refreshing our perception of the socio-political and intellectual world of these times. Janaki's working life intersected with several significant historical events: the rise of Nazi Germany and World War II, the struggle for Indian independence, the social relations of science movement, the Lysenko affair, the so-called Green Revolution, the dawn of environmentalism and the protest movement against a proposed hydroelectric project in the Silent Valley in the 1970s and 80s, to highlight just a few. She corresponded with major personalities of the times, including political leaders like Nehru, biologists like Cyril D. Darlington, J.B.S. Haldane, H.H. Bartlett, geographers Carl Sauer, and social activists like Hilde Seligman, who all played significant roles in shaping her Weltanschauung and her science. She was a participant in landmark scientific meetings and published prolifically in peer-reviewed Indian and international journals of science, most of which were founded during her lifetime, besides co-authoring a book, Chromosome Atlas of Cultivated Plants, 1945, considered a Bible of practitioners in the discipline. She would also be involved in the nation-building process, holding lofty public positions in her country of birth. Janaki, the biography, provided an axis for me about which to build a contextual history of science in the 20th century. But the challenge was also about how to balance a constructivist epistemology with historical narrative or social history, necessary when dealing with complex historical settings such as colonial and post-colonial societies. Importantly, the biography has non-human actors at its center in the form of wandering plants, much as it has a nomad woman scientist at its heart. In fact, I discovered to my delight that the biography offered a wonderful opportunity to engage not only in the micro-social, but also macro history, such as the debates on the social relations of science, of state-led science, and what freedom meant to the scientist against the backdrop of major 20th century world events, as the World War II, the rise of the Nazis, as I mentioned earlier on, and the denunciation of Mendelian genetics in Soviet Russia under Stalin. Alternating between the scientist's microcosm and the macro and public contexts of her scientific practice, this biographical narrative gradually unfolds to disclose in parallel also the private and social lives of plants and their evolution and travels across landscapes on the human trail. The biography, alternatively put, is the story of the symbiosis between plants and humans in the 20th century, as articulated in the life and practice of a trailblazing Asian woman scientist. Janaki pioneered research in cytosystematics, plant breeding, ethnobotany, and ecology, which is the systematic study of the dynamic relationship between peoples, plants, and environments. The third, and perhaps the most important reason for writing this biography, was to open a window into how science works. When scientific discoveries or scientific facts are formally presented with the notion of objectivity, histories of actions or workings, as well as the human touch behind these, are eliminated, simply lost or rendered invisible in the narrative. In other words, they get black boxed. To know how science works, it needs opening up or unpacking the black box and making the messy traces visible again. Writing a scientific biography offers just such an opportunity. Such a history aims to build a contextual history of how science is created locally, globally, and also transnationally, taking on board the social, cultural, and political context of science, the external social factors shaping science, such as funding structures, institutions, political influences, peer reviews, and bureaucracy, and the influence of caste, gender, class, and race relations on the way scientific knowledge is shaped. This is all of these external factors, but also the places and cultures of doing science, such as the laboratory and the field. And unabashedly, the flesh and blood or the human factors that fuel it, such as feelings, likes, dislikes, ambitions, ideas, ideologies, influences, friendships, career choices, idiosyncrasies, frustrations, and joys, not just for the biography, but for all those integral to her social and professional worlds. In this sense, this is not just a biography, but a compound web of biographies, taking on a net-like reticulate form through which light shines bright on the system, the swarm of actors, and the myriad ways in which scientific knowledge is constructed. In short, it aims to produce a global micro-historical narrative. As far as my chief focus is concerned, I'm particularly partial to women from within the field sciences, as opposed to the laboratory, and especially those located in the border zone between the field and the laboratory, and even more on those located in the in-between or the shadows of state institutions. Further, when we consider the extant literature on Indian scientists, one finds it's all about national institutional builders or scientists of the state, and invariably men, and those trained in the laboratory sciences of, say, physics, of nuclear physics in particular, and chemistry, representatives of the dominant model of doing science. On the other hand, probing the interstices, the borders, the folds of the dimly lit narrow bylanes of this heterogeneous landscape called science, helps shine light on those like Janaki, who chose to practice their science beyond the pathways determined and regulated by the state apparatus. Janaki's science was, to borrow the astrophysicist S. Chandrasekhar's words, it was about achieving personal perspectives while wandering, mostly in the lonely byways of science. Now for a bit of, bit of entertainment as well. It's, you have E.K. Krishnan, who's Janaki's father, Sub-Judge E.K. Krishnan. He was a very erudite. He had a lovely, very rich library and a keen horticulturist and ornithologist. And seen on the right was the house he built, the Edavalata house, which he built in Mahi, which is in today's state of Pondicherry, earlier North Malabar. And you have Janaki's mother, Kuruvai Devi Amma. She was born to John Child Hannington of the Madras Civil Service. Of course, he had not publicly acknowledged this fact. So Kuruvai Devi Amma was born to John Child Hannington and Kuruvai Kunyukurumbi of Talisheri of erstwhile Malabar. And this is the Edathil house built by the sub-judge, Janaki's father, in 1891. And as I've said, that the photograph was taken a few years before its demolition in 2009. So she was born here in this house on 4th November, 1897. Janaki's family, it might be noted, rather than impede, which is the usual narrative that one hears or reads, acted as a great resource for her science. Botany, in fact, was a familial enterprise. Her siblings, nieces, and nephews would contribute enormously by collecting, preserving, labeling, and dispatching plant material to her across the world or wherever it was that she needed them. Some of them would also join her on collecting excursions and field work, which were sometimes nothing less than adventurous. So you have a short resume of her education and chiefly education, not career, I'm sorry. So I'm not going to read that out. So she's one of the students of the first batch of the first women's college to be established in the Madras city, called the Queen Mary's College, 1915. And she goes on to graduate from the Madras University. Teaches very briefly her career, WCC, of course. And her doctorate was awarded by the University of Michigan. You have another one. I might use the pointer at this point. So you have, so she was an Oriental Barber scholar at the University of Michigan. And there is a very interesting group here. I was just talking to, Baswati and Sandhya about there being other women who've achieved a lot, even during this early period. But we know nothing about them. I'm just sort of in the process of recovering these names and what they did. So here we got someone called Archie Ipe, who is one of the very early doctors. And she again hailed from Travancore. And she was part of the missionary network, which made it possible for her to go to Philadelphia and study medicine. Here you have the Kashmiri Sharkeshwari Agha, an eminent educationist, early 20th century, we know nothing about. Here you have Primola Shahani, one of the early Barber scholars. Again, we know nothing about her. And of course, you have Janaki here, and Janaki with her other, the Oriental Barber scholars were selected from Japan, China, and Philippines, and India. So you have Janaki. She, as I earlier briefly mentioned, she pioneered researches in cytosystematics, plant breeding, ethnobotany, and ecology. And you have here with Doris Holdrup, which she had a very close relationship with. This is late 1920s. Sisterhood was of utmost importance to Janaki when it came to practicing science. Despite her lack of institutional power, owing to her gender, I'm talking of Chase, or even a doctorate for that matter, American agrostologist, a grass expert, and suffragette, Mary Agnes Chase had built a network of women agrostologists and serious grass collectors across the world, several of whom she mentored. Janaki was, for instance, one of them, and perhaps the only one in South Asia to have kept up a regular correspondence with her throughout the 1930s. Chase's The First Book of Grasses, published 1922, sent to her by the author herself, was Janaki's constant companion from the late 1920s. Again, actually the power of sisterhood here as well. You've got this is a Queen Mary's College group. You've got Janaki here. This is after she received her doctorate from the University of Michigan. This is during a summer vacation, 1933, circa 1933. And you've got her British American friend who I'm working on now, Eileen McFarlane, geneticist, the rose geneticist. I happened to mention two of Baswati's students today, Manisha and Vikas, who've had shown this wonderful gesture of naming a library which they put together in the hostel, and they named it after Janaki Ammal. And you have Amrita, who's painted a portrait of Janaki and stuck on the door. And I thought this was a wonderful gesture, and to commemorate tomorrow as well. So you have here Eileen McFarlane, the rose geneticist, and you have another batchmate of Janaki called N.K. Narayani. She's again one of the early doctors from South India. And this is their Miss McCormick, who's actually, they acted as their mentor. You can see them in saris. Here again, you have Eileen McFarlane, is this in 1955. And Janaki here in 1955, when she was, given awarded an honorary doctorate from her alma mater, the University of Michigan. And this is another close friend of theirs, Catherine Fellows. And this is the first the first woman anywhere in the world who worked on the genetics of reptiles. Frida Blanchett, married to Frank Blanchett, who's also a herpetologist. Forging national and international connections was integral to the Nomad scientist. Amiable, focused, articulate, and tenacious. Besides being a cosmopolite with a feisty and defiant sense of humor, Janaki made allies easily. Several such linkages and connections resulted in close friendships across class, race, gender, and culture, forming heterogeneous, non-hierarchical, and dynamic constellations, which helped her immensely. These names included such people as Mary Agnes Chase, as you mentioned, as you've seen before. You've got H.H. Bartlett, who was her mentor, N.L. Bohr, who is again a grass expert who spent a lot of time in Assam in the Forest Service and then went back to Kew Gardens to become a taxonomist. And again, Eileen McFarlane, with whom Janaki had a very close relationship. They all held positions of authority within institutions of the state apparatus, except Eileen, and were themselves nomadic in temperament. Besides those eminent figures of royal science, as against nomad science, like Darlington and J.B.'s Haldane, she had a close relationship with these men too. Men and women of social positions, such as Hilda Seligman, a sculptress, a British sculptress, F.C. Stern, Eva Fauncrook, Ralph Peer. He was a gentlemanly horticulturalist who specialized in camellia. And several non-scientists, including members of her own family, were part of this constellation, whom she could rely on to execute her escapes or to join with combined powers and innovate. One of her long-standing relationships, including collaboration, was with the British-American cytogenetist I've mentioned, Eileen McFarlane, whose biography I'm in the process of writing. She spent quite a lot of several years in India, and I'm interested in particular in her Indian sojourn. Sciences are diverse, and very importantly, there are and have been diverse ways of doing science than those the Nobel Prize Committee or some similar authority is willing to recognize. And these ways demand equal attention, if not more. It will still be science worthy of contemplation and scrutiny if small and not big science. If field-centered or located in the border zone of the laboratory and the field and not lab-centered. If slow and not fast science. If it is science in the making and not finished science. And if cross-disciplinary and unifying, even embracing humanities and not confined to imagined silos of disciplines. While state science is eccentric, drawing everything towards the center, formalized and finalized kind of top-down science, not only solid, cold, and rigid, not unlike the state itself, privileging a fixed order of things, but also fast and sometimes even hasty. Nomad science is an eccentric, moving away from the center, imaginative and creative scientific practice, and thereby necessarily slow, exploring problems that are transitional and fluid, and focused on working from matter upwards. Also, very importantly, one that is punctuated by moments of wonderment. The present biographical case study yields, among other things, to those of who are familiar with Bruno Latour, who's just passed away, to a Latourian science in action analysis, which is of science in the making as against finished science. Inspired by this biographical case study is inspired by the constructivist turn in the philosophy of science, which explored cultures of science and technology and demonstrated how scientific facts and objects are constructed. However, in the place of Latour's team of male scientists doing science in a privileged site, such as an European laboratory of microbiology, for instance, the focus here is on a 20th century career of a highly mobile Asian woman scientist, which spanned continents. The chief protagonist is one who did science in between, in the border zone of the lab and the field, and importantly, while trapped between, as the philosopher Deleuze says, between a rock and a hard place, between what nourishes and inspires and the state that imposes. Further, one of the things that this biography aims to demonstrate is that the history of modern genetics was not all about genes or DNA, or about Drosophila or Enothera genetics. Instead, it was a pluralistic practice involving a range of practitioners, aims, objects, techniques, styles, and of mixed cultures of doing science, of which we know very little and therefore demands concerted probing. This biography argues that nomad science is by definition slow science, and that Janaki's nomadism, of which the study is a clear demonstration, manifested in at least 4 ways: in-betweenness, cross-disciplinarity, opening lines of flight, and adopting a problem-based model of doing science. The biography offers a unique opportunity to consider the unlikely discipline of cytogenetics as nomad science, among other things. Unlikely because the state, both in the colonial and post-colonial context, was the chief employer of cytogeneticists, either at plant breeding and agriculture stations, as Janaki was, and universities very much less so, with its goal of reducing the gap between research and application, and speedily at that. So how does nomad science necessarily slow then become an appropriate description of Janaki's practice when she chiefly operated within such regimented state settings? Using Deleuzian lenses, combined with insights from border studies, including those that investigate liminality and mobility in the modern world, and in the lab field border zone, I make a modest attempt in my book to shine light on those nomadic tendencies that animated Janaki's life in science. You can see her, this is a photograph of Janaki, as I've written there, on a solitary expedition to Nepal. This assistant, the Nepalese assistant, was sometimes used as an assistant to fix her plant material. The site of Janaki's scientific practice was the border zone, as I said, between what the state imposed on her and her own personal research goals. Deleuze and Guattari observed that the in-between has consistency and enjoys both an autonomy and a direction of its own. The life of the nomad is the intermezzo. The intermezzo, or the interlude, signifies transition and mobility, and it is in such liminal spaces that multiplicity or heterogeneity thrives, and where nomadic individuals like Janaki enjoy the freedom to test out new ideas and undertake creative experimental work, without being cowed down by the tyranny of hierarchy or even patriarchy rife in state institutions. However, borders are ambiguous and unstable, rendering life in the border zone, which is the bridge that connects what is and what can or will be, precarious and volatile, filled with pain, anxiety, and even humiliation in Janaki's case. Also, the independence experience in the liminal zone is short-lived, because the state is forever looking to enslave the nomad into achieving the goals set by it, and very importantly, economically and in the shortest possible time. It somehow manages eventually to subdue the nomad's originality and creative inventiveness. Janaki is ambulant, but nevertheless rigorous and undoubtedly slow science, working on one specific example after another and generating a series of local singularities before synthesizing or federating, as the French philosopher Michel Serres would have it, to construct the global picture while located at an imperial breeding station or the border zone of the field in the laboratory, outside of theory. Janaki's mode of practice we might describe as procedural, working one step at a time, cumulative and combinatorial. She adopted an ecological, encyclopedic approach to making scientific knowledge. It involved making a great series of local, small-scale, and singular discoveries slowly and progressively over a lifetime of wandering, carving out fragments of an ever-changing and many-hued imaginary evolutionary jigsaw puzzle of planetary scale. This was slow science in the making, and an unfinished and an indeterminate pursuit by definition, which went against the very grain of state science. Deleuze reminds us, state science, Deleuze reminds us, only takes what it can appropriate of nomad or ambulant science, with the rest either repressed, treated as noise, or simply denied scientific status. So the fate of Janaki's invention, the sacrum maize hybrid, which she aptly referred to as the Cinderella of the sugarcane station, which is the Coimbatore sugarcane station, is substantial evidence of this marginalization. It would take a 4 decades, a painfully long time, when the hybrid flowered almost magically for the first time ever, not unlike in a fairy tale, to convince the authorities of state science that her hybrid was indeed genuine. While the in-between enabled women in particular to craft a creative life in science, it was not without challenges in institutions of the state apparatus, where hierarchy and patriarchy, as I said, were rife. When Janaki accepted Nehru's offer in 1952 of the post of special duty officer in charge of the reorganization of the BSI, she knew it was going to be a very challenging task, not only because it was an onerous one, but because she would be faced with much resistance in executing her unorthodox and disruptive idea of contaminating taxonomy with cytology. The fresh, undigested, bitter taste of newness, these words borrowed from Michel Tonier from his Wind Spirit. The bitter taste of newness of her ideas was too much for the newborn Indian state to palate, which instead preferred to heed the advice of the Kew Gardens, which was a center of royal science during this time, as far as plant taxonomy was concerned, rather than a nomad scientist like herself. Change and innovation are, after all, abominable to the state, which desires quick results and demands that status quo is maintained at all times. In a sense, the in-between is a veritable fount of fascinating nomad tales of self-creating individuals, of which Janaki's life and science is the shining example of one punctuated by war, death, loss, love, and creativity. Just as the state and the nomad mutually constitute each other and coexist, so do the laboratory and the field, which are not entirely different or always separate cultures of doing science. One is inconceivable, in fact, without the other. Importantly, as the historian of science, Robert Cole, explains, the location of their meeting is not a line or a boundary, but a broader frontier of vigorous interaction, exchange and intermingling, and with no clear advantage to either. One of the characteristics of the lab-field border is movement, and movement involves time for those who occupy the border zone. Cytogenetists like Janaki demanded very little by way of capital investment in their science. It was small-scale science, as against big science funded by the state. All it required was a powerful microscope with a camera lucida attached to it, used for making drawings, and chemicals that would go into the preparation of high-quality slides. It, however, required great expertise and experience to entrap a slice of life between two pieces of glass and bring the chromosomes into sharp focus, and even more to make accurate observations on the basis of these. Janaki had a way with this, and it went a long way in making her a respectable cytologist across the world. It was, however, extremely slow science. Janaki's border practice involved collecting material, sometimes involving long stretches of travel time in the field, preparing slides in the laboratory, and spending innumerable hours of study under the microscope, studying chromosomes for their shape, number, and of anything extraordinary that might be happening, besides undertaking experiments in the field, both to improve plants through hybridization and polyploidy, breeding and introduction, and for taxonomic ends, experimental taxonomy. A border courier demanded, again, as Cole has explained, a synthesis of sympathy and intellect, qualities, observation and experiment, spontaneity and control, laboratory and field, qualities Janaki possessed and techniques she employed to great benefit in her practice. She was a border person with a border courier, correlating the best features of traditional natural history, thus connecting her to the colonial naturalists of the East India Company by an unbroken thread. I'm talking of people like William Roxburgh or Koenig or Nathaniel Wallach, people like that, and also connecting her to experimental lab biology in a creative synthesis. Also, The biological side of the problem was only one side. As the American evolutionary biologist Edgar Thurston has pointed out, it was quite as much a problem of history. Biology was not just about biology, but it was also a problem of history, of archaeology, because she's, going to paleobotany, for instance, anthropology, nutrition, and sociology. Janaki was among those few who creatively united in her scientific practice diverse knowledge streams, including the humanities, especially anthropology. Her method was a reflection of her rhizomatic epistemology. It was fluid, adaptive, and synthetic, and aimed at inventing new ways of ordering or classifying transitional flora. Janaki's everyday life at the breeding station, where she was employed in the early years, was a dramatic unfolding of science and action, developing in unexpected ways. She was euphoric when she succeeded in creating new hybrids, her epiphanic moments, especially the challenging intergeneric ones, like the sugarcane maize hybrid, and overwhelmed with excitement when she discovered unusual chromosomal behavior, but also overcome with misery and frustration when, for instance, stray goats gobbled up a precious hybrid, reducing months of labor to naught, or when she was not permitted to publish her research findings, or simply when there was nothing happening. I suppose it's familiar. After an initial high at the breeding station, where an exciting new world of research had opened out to her, and she was able to contribute a thing or two to sugarcane breeding and cytotaxonomy, Janaki grew increasingly frustrated with the state's attempts to discipline and direct her actions. She had already performed the Escape Act once before, after a particularly short interlude at Trivandrum, where she was a professor at a men's college, the first woman professor of a men's college, because she found the city's conservatism and patriarchy not to her taste, but more importantly, because her research had to be put on the back burner. She was willing to trade any amount of money for the freedom to wander away from regimented paths and mimetic grooves and accomplish something original by way of research in cytogenetics. This was, in fact, how she justified her very existence. She was morally compelled, as it were, to move away from the state in her constant effort to be a nomad, to find time, space, and quiet to address her personal research goals. Janaki was a border worker, frequently changing the locale or the territory of her practice, forcing the biographer to redraw her nomadic cartography continually. As someone who pushed back the boundaries of knowledge in the field of plant cytogenetics, her life shines light on the vexing question, which I suppose is a question that can be posed to you all as well, of what may motivate scientists to move. Her dictum seems to have been adapt, move, or perish. Darlington, we may recall, commented on one occasion that her only drawback from an employer's point of view was that she would never stay anywhere for long. The nomadic is a tendency towards deterritorialization, a movement by which one leaves the territory, or what has been termed the line of flight by Deleuze. Janaki's life in science was molded by her frequent escapes, the lines of flight from controlling or repressive environments. Her life might be read as a series of interludes, transitions, and anti-mimetic moves, for the nomad values freedom and the journey rather than the destination. Her rhizomatic and feminist subjectivity was one of radical rootlessness, at home nowhere, and of multiple belongings, at home everywhere. At one point in her life, after the experience of a deadly war, this is in London, she felt the whole world had become her home. Having said that, it was not the actual act of traveling that defined the nomad, as much as the subversion of set conventions or the undermining of the power and authority of the state. Janaki was also, however, a literal nomad, traversing the fringes of state science institutions across 3 continents, and frequently opening lines of flight to break free from mental confinement and explore novel, liberatory, and creative trajectories, even when these were only leaps of faith. Without a sense of danger, life is not worth living as far as she was concerned. Importantly, by being nomadic, Janaki, the scientist, was also challenging the traditional view of the nomad as embodied in the male persona. Her nomadic wandering was punctuated by occasional acts of disappearance, of becoming invisible to the state. In her case, by retreating to the dense forests of the Western Ghats or the Himalaya to collect wild plants and gather knowledge of their uses from the original dwellers of these ecosystems. She was, after all, strongly vocal about the need to conserve these hideaways, sanctuaries, and privilege the indigenous over the colonial from the point of view of knowledge. Janaki's project was thus one of botanical modernization and decolonization, one which fitted hand in glove with her ontological and epistemological nomadism. When Janaki became tired of the strictures of the breeding station Coimbatore, its unscientific and controlling atmosphere, she began desperately looking for a mode of escape, which sometimes appeared before her in the form of epistemic communities such as science congresses. In her case, the International Genetics Conference in Edinburgh, 1939. She reimagined herself at the outbreak of war as a scientist refugee in the manner of several other scientists at this time, Jewish scientists in particular, only that hers was a self-imposed exile. Britain became her refuge from an imperial breeding station where patriarchy and pseudoscience were omnipresent. Also, she found Coimbatore too Brahmanical for her taste, in contrast to cosmopolitan Madras. Janaki, an independent woman, a border-crossing plant geneticist, involved in necessarily slow science such as evolutionary biology or cytogeography or perhaps geophysical science, felt India, both colonial and post-colonial, with its focus on state-led fast science that further bolstered gender and other inequalities, had nothing to offer her by way of facilities, a stimulating atmosphere, or research career. She was also highly mobile during the war years, shuttling between the John Innes Horticultural Institution in Merton and the Kew Gardens, besides the Cambridge School of Agriculture as part of her researches. She received just enough by way of maintenance, and London was a dangerous place to be in, with all the bombing and destruction to life, and yet she bloomed like a desert flower amidst the thorns. The nomad couldn't be happier, and her science stood to gain. Janaki's exile in Britain lasted 9 years, during which time she suffered the ravages of war and extreme loneliness. But it was also the period that saw her become highly productive and evolve into a world-ranking cytogeneticist. Her brief return to India in 1948, only months after India's independence, turned out to be depressing, in the extreme to her, because state science had taken hold of the country like never before, even worse than the colonial state. And it seemed as if all research had ended in the newly independent nation. This time, her escape was to the Nepal Himalaya you've seen a picture of, the first woman to go on a solitary exploration in the region in the name of science. The problem of the origin of cultivated plants, which was her problem, is an adventure in apparent chaos, noted Edgar Anderson, the evolutionary biologist. Chaos is, however, seductive to the nomad. Rather than something to run away from, it's an opportunity to be creative. A genuine understanding of the problem of evolutionary relationships of plants, both in the past and the latent genetic qualities to be explored in the future, depended on a thorough and detailed knowledge of the evolutionary pattern of each individual group. That is, the evolutionary steps traversed before a species came into being. And it was a bird's eye view of this complex process that Janaki and Darlington's chromosome atlas of cultivated plants provided. The authors of the atlas represented two different approaches to science, but complemented each other very well. While Janaki, the nomad scientist, worked out and accumulated chromosome numbers for the hybrids, polyploids, and wild relatives of cultivated plants, caught up in the fluid processes of becoming, Darlington, the royal scientist, provided an overview and analysis of these, which was an exercise in reduction. Rather than work from essences, Janaki encountered the problem and followed it to where it took her, generating much empirical data in the process. Her projects were about assimilation, compilation, and synthesis rather than analysis. And very importantly, always works in progress and on the much tangled and dynamic history of relationship between man and plants. Very tellingly, she referred to the alternative self-organized places she created for research at Shornur in Malabar and Madurai in the state of Madras as a garden. She called it a garden. And she called one a hermitage, respectively, which allowed solitude rather than, she didn't call it an institute or a center, terms associated with hierarchical structures of state science. Janaki's scientific contributions might be organized under 6 heads: cytotaxonomy, experimental breeding and plant introduction; cytogeography, origin and diffusion of farming practices; gene ecology, and ethnobotany. She did not invent or use a model organism in her researches in the manner of her contemporaries, most of who clearly was representatives of royal science. For instance, the crepes of Babcock and Stebbins, theory of the Michigan botanists, including Janaki's doctoral supervisor, B.M. Davis, and of Bartlett; the Tradescantia or corn of Edgar Anderson; the maize of McClintock; the Nicotiana of Kostoff, and so on. Nor did she use a theorematic model in her researches, which involved boiling data down to construct axioms or extract universal constants based on a notion of fixed essences, which Darlington was doing. The model instead she followed was a problem-based one. She was focused on concrete problems of mapping changes, transmutations, affinities, similitudes, or relations, and celebrating singularities or the singular conditions under which something new was produced. Janaki worked on an extensive genera of flowering plants, adding a new group each time she moved to a new location. So much so that by the end of the 1970s, she investigated a whole range of temperate and tropical flowering plants, both the domesticated and their wild counterparts, and all those hybrids or entities in between, from the point of their origin and distribution. From economic plants like the sugarcane and other grasses, ornamentals like the magnolia, medicinal plants like the solanum, aromatics like the cymbopogon, and finally to the primitive cultivars of the humid forests of the Western Ghats. It's worth mentioning here that rather than expend energy fighting the Kerala government on the silent file issue, she chose the path of least resistance and creatively floated the idea of undertaking a pioneering project in the cytogenetics and flora of these undisturbed forests. An important aspect of Janaki's nomadic subjectivity was the persistent temptation to die, the death drive, a drive to escape life, hardwired into it. Her deep-seated death wish, her tendency to embrace tragedy rather than evade it, in fact, helped her break free of oppressive and stimulating or even seemingly impossible situations in extraordinary ways. She had no fear of death. Janaki was also one among the new generation of naturalists, deeply inspired by accounts of heroism, adventure, fortitude, and tenacity. Her private library, we know, was filled with books by explorers, men and women who transgressed boundaries and lived adventurous lives, to which this biography is proof. The ontological similarities between the human and non-human, plants in her case, elements of Janaki's assemblages are particularly striking. Her plants were nomads. This, as you can read, is rhododendron yakushimana. She created a cultivar, Koichirvada. The ontological similarities, her plants were nomads, hybrids, and polyploids, displaying a multiplicity of things at once, not unlike herself, and equally possessed the power of metamorphosis. They were fluid or transitional entities with the potential of escape, like breaking free from sterility, akin to her lines of flight, to a higher ploidy, for instance, and thereby evolve, albeit with some help from a colchicine-like toxin and the hands of a skillful breeder that she was. The heterogeneous alliances she made with people and plants, the entanglements, the assemblages or multiplicities, amplified in complexity and performative power, especially through creative recombinations. This was especially true of her colchicine work at Wisley, the Wisley Royal Horticultural Society's gardens at Wisley, where she worked on ornamentals, temperate ornamentals. The place linked her to several young cytologists, mostly women, and also non-scientists, chiefly nurserymen and gentlemen horticulturists. Also, plants that once earned her attention would never end up as abandoned workings, but would instead become part of her growing assemblage. Janaki had several epiphanic moments in her career, chiefly to do with her success in creating tetraploids using colchicine. In a plant breeder's career, the manifestation of a plant's tetraploid marked an inflection point in the history of its cultivation, the polyploid being fertile and true breeding. For the cytologist breeder, it was a thing of joy, as the plant he or she had so expertly created was equipped to pursue an independent course of evolution. The nomad scientist must follow the flow of matter or material, or follow a problem through where it might lead. Much like how Janaki pursued or wished to pursue the sugarcane and the camellia among several other plant genera to their near and distant and many homes. Adding the ethnographic tool to her practice by invoking layered and comparative narratives of plant-man relationships played out in forests, for instance, was one of the many ways by which she resisted reductionism or the quantitative processing of royal science and its practitioners. Janaki lived a double life at the Wisley Gardens, making tetraploids and running chromosome counts of ornamentals such as the rhododendron and magnolia for members of the Royal Horticultural Society by day, and doing independent research on the cytogeography of flowering plants by night, a new disciplinary trajectory that she was pioneering. By the end of her tenure at Wisley in 1951, she had collected enough chromosome counts of a range of plants and produced several new polyploids besides publishing journal articles. But this was still at the level of undisciplined wandering. Quiet reflection, a stimulating research atmosphere, and time were crucial if the larger map of the link between polyploidy and plant migration was to be delineated. But this was not to be had. And the reason she would take flight again. So Janaki lived multiple lives as a cytogeneticist, a field biologist, a plant geographer, a paleobotanist, an evolutionary systematist, an experimental breeder and ethnobotanist, a historian and ethnographer, and not least a naturalist, traveler, explorer, and plant ecologist, identities that might easily be associated with the blueprint of a border culture. It's difficult to name even one among her scientific geneticist contemporaries who adopted such a cross-disciplinary methodology in their researches. So Janaki was a deep and thick or many-layered kind of science, the result of careful exploration of the local, complex, and singular connections between myriad fields of knowledge, a practice that was genuinely cross-disciplinary. It's true that Janaki was unable to realize or bring to fruition some of her original thoughts on evolutionary biology, so much so that she considered her life a failure, not to be fussed about. There's no doubt, however, that her life is a blazing testament to intellectual integrity, tenacity, and creativity in the face of upheavals and adversities, to transgressing boundaries and reinventing oneself incessantly, but slowly, and fundamentally to cultivating the habit of freedom, to become who one is while giving back to human reason, as Bachelard would have it, its original churning and vigor. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Any questions? Yeah, Sushil.
What would be
I can hear you though.
yeah, thanks. So what would be her most notable scientific published literature?
Publication.
Published literature, scientific literature coming from her.
Right? Yeah, I don't think I can just pinpoint one. As I said, every one was a kind of incremental addition to the fund of knowledge that she was creating. So it's not like as if it was like a discovery. You can't go by that mode of thinking. This is not about a discovery mode. This is outside of a discovery mode. which is what precisely I was trying to explain in the start. But if you wanted to talk about a book, this is the only book that she's written, was again a synthesis. As I said, it's a combinatorial project. So you can't say, look, in 1945, she discovered something like McClintock did, and the paper is therefore a seminal paper. No, I think every one of it was. It's a very different kind of thinking that you need to get into to understand what she was doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very wonderful talk of a different style, which we are familiar with.
Yeah.
So this is about the Silent Valley issue. I mean, we were in school when that happened.
Can I get your name, please? Because it's like you know my name, but I don't know you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It helps. It helps.
I'm a researcher here.
Sorry,
I'm a researcher here. My name is Gopakumar. Yes. So
and where I come from, yeah.
precisely. So
Do you want to come forward, Gopa? You can even avoid the mic. You can just, I can hear you. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. It's a high.
this is for the Zoom related
Oh, I'm
issues.
sorry. Yeah.
So this is about the Silent Valley. So this is about the Silent Valley. At that time, she got involved, but she, if I remember correctly, she was not, creating a movement or anything, but she was trying to kind of demonstrate how unique the system is or something like that. I vaguely remember.
Yeah, but can you tell me where it is that you ever came across Janaki when this thing happened? Because nobody even knows that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is, it's something
Because
else.
it's all about men who
that's
were
right.
around the Silent
Yeah, so
Valley
that's
movement.
precisely. And that was also.
Or it's Sugata Kumari. And
Yeah,
later
so-
on, Indira
yeah.
Gandhi who helps.
Yeah.
But where is Janaki in this narrative?
Well,
I
actually,
didn't come across.
I actually had a chat with one of her Sugatamari's sister. She was my professor and all that. So
Okay.
there was this mention about, having a political aspects. She kind of removed, if I remember correctly. I don't know. This was long time back.
Sure.
So is that true? I mean, she tried to, to demonstrate why this needs to be protected and that project needs to be discarded. And that eventually happened. So
Yes. So what?
can you comment on that? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, what I'm glad you raised this question because it gives me an opportunity to say this. One is that if you look at the literature on the Silent Valley protest movement, if you read the literature, whatever has been written about the Silent Valley protest movement, you will not find Janaki Ammal in it. Janaki Ammal is absent. And I will be, very thrilled if you brought me one published piece which has Janaki Ammal mentioned in it. No. So what I'm doing with this book here is actually reinscribing Janaki into the Silent Valley narrative. But her approach to this protest movement, as I had mentioned, was not about, it was an approach of least resistance, as I said. It was not about joining people like M.K. Prasad and Whitaker and several others going into the forest or speaking about this disaster that was going to happen and what it meant at schools and institutions and or the newspapers themselves didn't take much of a stand on this issue anyway. But they were actually taking it had become a movement of sorts. But Janaki Ammal is never in this. But Janaki Ammal was playing a very quiet role because she was very much part of the Kerala State Science Policy Committee, which nobody knows about. So this is thanks to Achyuta Menon, the chief minister, who had that sort of an enlightened figure that he was. He is the one who invites Janaki, who is at this time an emerita professor at the Center for Advanced Studies, to come over and be part of this committee. And it is she who is actually instrumental for establishing the PG Forestry Institute, in fact, the Kerala Forestry Institute. All of this is unsaid. All of this is not known or even sort of concretized. All of it is about these men and their protest movement. What Janaki does is, rather than go into activism in that sense, actually coming out and being an activist, what she does is, mind you, she's in her 80s. She's in her hospital bed even, because she'd broken her, a limb. And what she does is, she tries to mobilize support internationally. So she writes to Darlington from her hospital bed and says, she's already in a kind of dementia is already settling in. So she repeats herself too, and if you read her letters to Darlington. But she wants to amass international support in order that this will gain the world's attention and something will be done to stop this. Because the kind of very aggressive left government, which would not listen to any other arguments, which would not even get into a dialogue with people from within the state or who are with the forest department, they would not get into a serious dialogue. If you look at all the correspondence, I had the luck to access material which sat in private collections, which is actually a correspondence between several members of the electricity board as well, with that of people like M.S. Swaminathan, who sitting at the man in human resource department, natural resources department in Delhi, who is a very close friend of V.K. Janaki Ammal, who is yet another person who V.K. Janaki Ammal writes to and says, look, I don't have an FRS to my name. You have. She was denied an FRS. I speak about this in this book too. I had written to the present president of the FRS, the kind of injustice that was done, and that the Royal Society had lost a wonderful chance of making the first, brown-skinned, non-white FRS way back when someone of her contemporary who'd done far less work, I would say. If you look at East Manton, Irene Manton, cytogeneticist. No other person has actually worked on temperate and tropical to the extent that Janaki did. But you have Irene Manton, who's been given an FRS, made an FRS. So Janaki is neither here nor there. I would ascribe this to her nomadic tendency. She was not, the Indian government didn't bother about her. She was given a Padma Shri way, when she was in her 80s in 1977. Neither did the British government, where she spent, in fact, most of her, a chunk of her work was done on British soil. So she missed the chance there. She misses a chance here. So Silent Valley, it was a path of least resistance. She decided she would go into the forest in order to collect material, or what material that she could, in order to do the first ever cytogenetic floral survey of these undisturbed forests. But she would never make it to Silent Valley because the forest officers would never allow her. They would give her any number of excuses, and and Janaki could never make it.
So let's ask if anybody from Zoom has any questions.
Is there any at all?
No, I don't see.
No,
There's nothing.
It would have had something.
No.
There's no question. That's wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Yes,
sure,
sure.
yeah.
Okay, so the question is from Bipasa Chakraborty. How can we summarize the nature of our research? If it was about a discovery, what else was it?
It was not a I don't know where to start really, because I think the whole point I was making was that it was not about a discovery. It was not about a seminal discovery. It is not. There are all kinds of sciences, and this is not about that. You have to think outside the Nobel Prize framework. It's different.
Okay, I think,
I'm arguing for that.
Yes.
It's for small science.
Okay, to end the session, on behalf of all of us, we would like to give you a collection of
That's wonderful.
collection.
Wonderful, yeah.
Thank you for I think it was a great talk, and it's not something that we very routinely hear.
Thank you.
So I think we will close the session. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me. Thank you.
But one thing I must say that
Yeah.
he was a freelance scientist.
She
Which
was,
is like,
she was not a freelance. She was always attached to some institution.
yeah,
But she would,
that's what-
but she would,
she changed the.
she would work her way around it. She was very clever.
So that's something you see the present generation doing much better. I think in between we were all very institutionalized or
Yeah.
most of the things were
Yeah.
instead.